Welcome to the channel where legends sleep. Tonight's story takes us to the mist-wrapped shores of ancient Britain, where Celtic myth and medieval legend have long entwined like roots beneath still water. This is a tale woven across centuries, carried in the whispers of Welsh bards and Arthurian chronicles, of a king who was never quite mortal, and a world that was never quite real. There is a lake here, dark and glass-like, holding secrets far older than the sword it conceals beneath its surface. There is a woman who is not quite a woman, a hand that rises from the depths to offer power, and a kingdom balanced between glory and its own undoing. Somewhere between history and dream, between the old gods and the new, a legend breathes, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear it. So lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. There is a place older than its own name, older than the roads that crossed it, older than the kings who claimed it, older than the stories that were told about it by firelight in the long dark of winter. It is the land we now call Britain, though once it had no single name at all, only the names of its rivers, its hills, its deep and sacred waters, each one spoken with the kind of reverence people reserve for things they do not fully understand. Close your eyes for a moment and let the world you know grow quiet. Imagine a land before the towns, before the roads of dressed stone, before the bells of any church rang out across a valley. This is Britain as it was in the age of myth, a place of vast forests where the trees grew so tall and close that the canopy above was like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral no human hand had built. Mist lay in the hollows each morning. Rivers ran cold and clear over beds of pale stone. And everywhere, quietly, the people who lived there felt the presence of something just beyond what the eye could hold. They had gods then, these early people, not gods housed in temples of marble, but gods who lived in the turning world itself, in the curl of the river as it bent around a mossy bank, in the particular stillness of a lake at dawn, when the water held the sky like a mirror and you could not quite tell which world was real and which was reflection. In the rowan tree at the edge of the clearing, hung with red berries like drops of old blood, standing alone as though it had always been waiting there for you. These were the gods of the Celts, a broad and ancient family of peoples who had settled across much of the land from the western sea to the far northern hills. They worshipped at the edges of things, at the shoreline where the land surrendered to water, at the threshold of the forest where the light gave out, at the moments between sleeping and waking, between life and whatever lay beyond it. These boundary places were holy. They were where the veil between the visible world and the unseen one grew thin as spider silk in the early morning. Water, above all, was sacred to them. Lakes and rivers were not merely features of the land. They were doorways. Offerings were cast into dark water, swords, torques of twisted gold, vessels of bronze, not thrown away but given, given to the something that lived beneath, something that was neither God nor spirit in any simple sense, but older than those words, older than the need to name things at all. The Celts understood that certain waters held a power that flowed from somewhere beyond the ordinary world, and they approached those places with care, and with gifts, and with silence. And so the story we are about to enter was not born in a throne room, or on a battlefield, or even in the mind of any single king. It was born here, in this ancient world of mist and sacred water. It was born long before the man at the center of it drew his first breath. Somewhere to the west, always to the west, where the sun goes to rest and the sea stretches out beyond knowing, there was said to be an island. Not an island you could sail to with a map, not a place on any chart. It had no fixed shore, no permanent coordinates, only a direction, west and further still until the ordinary world fell away entirely. The Celts called it by many names across many centuries, but the name that has survived the longest, worn smooth as a river stone by all its years of use, is this: Avalon. Avalon, the Isle of Apples, some say, for the word carries within it the old breath of the apple tree, abo afal. And the apple in Celtic tradition was no ordinary fruit. It was the food of the other world. To eat an apple given by the hand of one who lived beyond the veil was to step outside of time entirely, to enter a place where wounds healed on their own, where the seasons did not press forward with their usual urgency, where sleep and waking blurred into something richer than either. On this island, it was said, certain people were taken at the moment of their greatest need, not in death exactly, not in the plain and final way that death usually arrives, something more like a long sleep, a rest between one age and the next. The island received them, and the island held them, quietly, in the way that deep water holds a stone, not lost, simply resting far below the surface, waiting for the moment when the world above would need them again. That promise of return, of rest, of something preserved beneath the surface of the world runs through everything that follows like a silver thread. You will find it at the beginning of this story. You will find it, whole and unchanged, at the end. But we are not there yet. For now, let the mist settle around you. Let the forest lean in close. Let the lake lie still and dark and full of whatever it holds beneath. The Britain we are entering is old, and it is patient, and it has been waiting a long time to tell you what it knows. Something is coming. Not yet, but soon. The world is about to hold its breath, the way it sometimes does, just before a remarkable thing occurs. And somewhere in the mist, already moving, already shaping the years ahead with careful and unhurried hands, a story has begun. That story begins, as so many do, with a king who wanted something he should not have had. Uther Pendragon was a man of great power and greater appetite. He ruled a fractured Britain, a land of rival chieftains and uneasy borders, where the old Celtic ways were slowly being worn thin by war and time. He was not a wicked man exactly, but he was a hungry one, and hunger, when it goes unchecked in a king, has a way of bending the world out of shape. What Uther wanted was Igraine, the wife of another lord, a woman of quiet grace and steady eyes, who did not return his longing. What Uther did in wanting her was to go to Merlin. Now Merlin had been in Britain longer than most dared to remember. He was not entirely of the human world, or so the old stories say, born of a mortal woman and something older, something that moved through the air above the sacred places and left no shadow when it passed. He was a seer and a shaper. He read the patterns of time the way a shepherd reads the sky, not guessing, but knowing, or knowing as much as any creature is permitted to know. And he had been watching Uther Pendragon with quiet, careful attention. When Uther came to him, Merlin listened. Then he made an offer, measured and deliberate, the way all his offers were. He said, "I will help you, but the child that comes of this, that child is mine to guide, not to keep, not to own, but to shape towards something the land will need." Uther, burning with want, agreed without truly understanding what he was agreeing to. That is the way of such bargains. And so, through Merlin's enchantment, Uther was made to appear as another man, and he came to Igraine in the night, and the world shifted on its foundations in some quiet and invisible way. A life was kindled, a story took root. The child was born on a winter's night in a fortress by the sea, with the sound of waves breaking below the cliffs. He was wrapped in warmth, and then very quickly given into Merlin's waiting hands. Uther's debt was paid before the morning came. Merlin carried the child south and inland, through sleeping valleys and along the edges of dark forests, to the home of a good knight named Ector. Sir Ector was a steady man, broad-shouldered and kind, who asked few questions and raised the boy as his own son. The child was given the name Arthur. He grew up knowing Ector as his father and Ector's son Kay as his elder brother, and he knew nothing at all about prophecy or kings, or the things that Merlin had seen moving like shadows through the years ahead. Arthur was, by all accounts, an unremarkable boy, and that was perhaps the point of him. He was not the tallest, nor the strongest, nor the quickest to laughter or anger. He carried firewood without complaint. He listened more than he spoke. He had a quality that is easy to overlook in a child, a kind of steadiness, a willingness to be still in a world that moved fast and loud around him. Merlin watched him from a distance, as a gardener watches a young tree, waiting for the moment that only patient eyes can see. Meanwhile, Britain was fraying. Uther Pendragon had died, and with him had gone the last thread of order holding the island's chieftains together. Lords quarreled, borders dissolved, smaller wars flickered and spread like fires in dry grass. The land had no king, and a land without a king in those days was a wound that would not close. It was then that Merlin moved. he arranged for a sign, one of those signs that seems impossible until the moment it happens, and then feels, to those who witness it, like the only thing that could ever have been true. In the yard of a great church, in a city where the lords had gathered to argue over succession, there appeared a stone, broad and gray and ancient-looking, as though it had always been there, and thrust deep into its heart, gleaming quietly in the winter light, was a sword. Around the blade, letters were carved into the stone itself. Those who crowded close to read them found the words simple and absolute. Whosoever pulls this sword from this stone is the right-wise born king of all Britain. The great lords tried, of course they did. Strong men, proud men, men who had spent their whole lives believing the world owed them its crowns. They gripped the hilt with both hands, planted their feet, and pulled. The sword did not move. It sat in the stone the way mountains sit in the earth, without effort, without apology, without any interest at all in what the men around it wanted. Days passed, then weeks. A tournament was called nearby, the kind of gathering that brought knights from every corner of the island. And among those who rode in was Sir Ector, with his son Kay, and Kay's younger brother Arthur, not yet 16, slight and quiet, carrying the baggage and minding the horses the way a younger brother does. On the morning of the tournament, Kay discovered he had left his sword behind at their lodgings. He sent Arthur to fetch it. Arthur ran back through the city streets, which were almost empty now that the crowds had moved toward the tournament grounds. When he reached their lodgings, the door was locked and no one answered. He tried twice, then stood in the cold street and thought. Nearby, he had seen the stone, the sword. He went to the churchyard. There was no one there. The guards had wandered off to watch the jousting. Arthur looked at the sword for a moment, the way a practical boy looks at a tool that might serve a purpose. Then he reached out, closed his hand around the hilt, and pulled. It came free as easily as a hand withdraws from water. Arthur looked at the sword in his hand. He turned it once, watching the light move along the blade. Then he walked back through the streets to find his brother. Kay recognized the sword immediately. His face changed. Something moved across it that was not entirely simple to name, and he brought Arthur to their father. Sir Ector looked at the sword. He looked at the boy holding it. Then he did something Arthur had never seen him do before. He knelt. Arthur did not understand at first. He asked his father to rise. Ector shook his head and began slowly and carefully to tell Arthur the things he had never been told. The lords were summoned back to the churchyard. There was disbelief, and then there was argument, and then one by one the watching crowd went quiet as Arthur set the sword back into the stone and drew it out again, and then again, each time as easily as breathing. The kingdom held its breath. Somewhere at the edge of the gathered crowd, not quite in the light, Merlin stood and watched. His expression, if anyone had thought to look, was not triumphant. It was something gentler than that. The look of someone who has waited a long time for a particular morning and has now at last seen it arrive. The boy who had carried firewood and minded horses stood in the winter yard with a sword in his hand and a crown in his future, and the long, slow work of a kingdom was about to begin. But before we follow that crown into the years ahead, let us go somewhere else for a moment. Somewhere older. Somewhere the light does not fall the way it does in the waking world. There is a lake in the west of Britain. There has always been a lake there. It sits in a fold of hills so ancient that the hills themselves seem to have forgotten how they came to be shaped that way, as if the land simply grew around the water, the way a tree grows around a stone. The surface of the lake is rarely still, not because of wind, though wind does cross it, but because the water has its own quiet life, its own slow turning, as if something below is breathing. The people who lived near that lake did not fish it. They did not sail it. They left offerings at its edge, flowers sometimes, or small clay figures pressed into the soft mud of the bank, and they did not linger after dark, not out of fear exactly, out of respect. There is a difference, though it is a fine one. They called her different names in different ages. Nimue, Vivian, the lady. Some called her nothing at all, because to name a thing is to claim a kind of ownership over it, and no one who understood the lake would dare to do that. She was not a goddess, or not precisely. She was something the old world made before it had words for what it was making. A keeper, a guardian, a presence woven into the water itself. She had lived in the lake since before the Romans came, before the Celts raised their hill forts and named their rivers, before the first human hand cupped water from that surface and carried it away. She had watched empires rise at the edges of the island and crumble back into the grass. She had watched forests grow and fall and grow again, and she had waited, with the particular patience of those who are not bound by mortal time, for the moments that mattered. If you had stood at the edge of that lake on a still morning and looked down into the water, you would have seen your own reflection first. But if you looked long enough, if you let your eyes soften and your breathing slow, you might have begun to see something else beneath your image, a light that was not sunlight, a depth that seemed to go much further than the ground should allow, and perhaps very far below, the outline of something vast and quiet and watchful. She did not often come to the surface, but when she did, it was never without reason. She came to Merlin long before Arthur was born. That much is agreed in the older tellings. She came to him when he was already ancient himself, though what ancient means for a man born of a mortal woman and some nameless spirit of the air is a question without a clean answer. Merlin had lived many lives by the time he found the lake. He had served kings and counseled them and watched them waste themselves on pride and ambition. He had worked his enchantments and read the turning stars and grown tired in the way that only very old and very powerful things can grow tired, not in the body, but somewhere deeper, in the place where purpose lives. He came to the lake at the edge of autumn. The reeds were turning gold. The water was the color of pewter under a clouded sky. He sat at the bank, and he was very still. And after a long time, she rose, not dramatically, not with thunder or blinding light. The water simply parted, slowly, the way a sleeper parts their lips to breathe. And she was there. Her hair was the deep green-black of still water at night. Her eyes were the color of the lake itself, gray and silver and full of a depth that unsettled even Merlin, who was not easily unsettled. They spoke. They spoke for a long time, the way old things speak when they have no urgency, only the slow trading of understanding. She knew things he did not know. He knew things she had been waiting to hear. There is a version of this meeting in which she becomes his student, and there is another version in which he becomes hers. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the honest word for what passed between them is simply recognition. She taught him the language of water, the way still surfaces hold memory, the way a lake will carry the echo of every voice that has ever spoken at its edge, not as sound, but as something felt, a vibration too low for the ear, but not for the chest, not for the blood. He taught her the language of stars, the long arithmetic of time, the slow grammar of prophecy. And somewhere in those long exchanges, Excalibur entered the story. The sword had not always been in the lake. In the older tellings, it was made elsewhere, in Avalon, that island at the western edge of the world where the laws of time and mortality grow thin, forged by hands that were not entirely human, made not only of metal but of something else, intention perhaps, or a kind of concentrated will, a sword that could not be broken, a sword whose scabbard, it was said, was worth more than the blade, for the scabbard kept its wearer from bleeding, kept the living wound from widening into death. She received it. She kept it. She carried it down beneath the water and held it in that deep, lightless place where the old powers of the island gathered and waited. She was not the only one of her kind. That is worth pausing on. Across the Celtic world, across the islands, across the water into Gaul and further, there were stories of women who stood at the thresholds, the Morrigan, who moved between life and death like smoke between rooms, the Bean Sida, who cried at the boundary before a crossing, the Morgans, the water women, the lake wives. They were not the same being, and yet they shared something, a nature that was neither fully of this world nor entirely of the other. They were the hinge. They were the still point between the turning of one thing and another. Nimue was of that order, a guardian of the in-between. And the in-between was where Excalibur belonged until the moment it was needed. That moment came on a gray morning when Arthur, newly made king and already beset by the difficulty of being won, found himself without a sword worthy of what he was being asked to do. The one he had drawn from the stone was gone by now, broken in an early skirmish, some telling say, as if even that miracle had its limits. Merlin brought him to the lake. Arthur stood at the edge and looked out across the water and saw, rising from its center, an arm, pale as birchwood, still as a painting, and in the hand at the end of that arm, held horizontally above the surface, as if offered to the sky, was a sword and a scabbard of dark leather worked with silver. A small boat came to the bank, appearing from the mist as if it had always been there. Arthur crossed the water and took the sword, and the arm lowered slowly, and the surface closed again, and the lake was a lake once more. He did not fully understand what he had been given, not the sword alone, but the covenant that came with it, a thread, silver and unbreakable, running from the king to the water to the woman who waited beneath it. She would watch him across all the years of Camelot's brightness and its long shadow. She would be present at the moments that counted. And when the time came, the final time, the time when even kings must cross the last threshold, she would be there again. But that time was not yet. There was a kingdom still to build. There was a table still to be made round, and a name still to be given to the dream of it, and many long years of torchlight and feasting and hope before the embers began, slowly, to cool. For now, Arthur rode back from the lake with Excalibur at his side. The water behind him lay flat and still and silver, and somewhere beneath it, in the deep, quiet place where old things rest and wait, Nimue settled back into the dark, patient, watchful, and very much present. Camelot was not built in a day, nor in a season. It rose the way all great things rise, slowly, stone by stone, intention by intention, until one morning the light fell across the towers in a particular way, and something in the air said, "Yes, this is the place, this is what was meant." The castle stood on high ground above a wide plain, and from its uppermost walls a man could see for many miles in every direction. The green roll of hills, the silver threads of rivers, the far-off smudge of forest where the old world still breathed and rustled and kept its own counsel. Arthur had chosen the site himself, walking the land for days before he spoke a word about it to anyone. He had stood at the crest of the hill in the early morning, the wind moving through the long grass around him, and felt something settle in his chest, a quietness. The great hall came first, then the walls, then the courtyards and the stables and the long corridors that caught the afternoon light and held it like amber. And at the center of it all, in the hall where the king would sit with his lords and his knights, they brought the table. It had come, so the stories say, as part of Guinevere's dowry, a gift from her father Leodegrance, who had once kept it in trust for Uther Pendragon, and now returned it to the sun. It was vast and perfectly round, smooth as still water, made from a single piece of oak, so old that no one could say which forest it had come from, or how long it had been growing in the dark before it was felled. There was no head to it, and no foot, no seat of greater honor than any other. Every man who sat at it sat equal to the man beside him, whether he was a king's cousin or a farmer's son who had proven his worth with a sword. This was Arthur's dream made visible. Not conquest, not dominion, something quieter and harder to hold. The idea that a kingdom could be built on fairness, that men could choose honor over advantage, that power was a thing to be used in service rather than hoarded behind high walls. The knights came from every corner of the known world. Lancelot, tall and grave, with eyes that held some distant sorrow even in his proudest moments. Gawain, Arthur's nephew, courteous and fierce in equal measure. Percival, young and earnest, who had grown up in the forest, knowing nothing of knights until the sight of them riding through the trees had lit something in him that could not be put out. Galahad, Lancelot's son, who moved through the world with a stillness that made other men feel, somehow, that they were standing in a beam of light. And many others, men with histories as long and tangled as old roots, men with scars and sins and moments of breathtaking bravery, all of them drawn here, to this hall, to this table, by the slow gravity of a dream worth believing in. For a time, it held. The stories from those years are full of light, of tournaments where honor was the only prize worth winning, of wrongs made right in distant villages, of roads made safe and boundaries made just. Bards sang of it for generations afterward, always with that particular ache in the voice that comes when you are singing about something that no longer exists. And then came the Grail. No one could say exactly when the vision first appeared. At a feast, perhaps, or in the quiet before one, the air in the great hall suddenly charged with something neither warm nor cold, but simply vast. A light, they said, a cup, half seen, luminous, moving through the room like a slow star before it faded and was gone. And every knight who had seen it felt the same thing in his chest. And emptiness he had not known was there, and a sudden terrible need to fill it. Merlin, had he still been present, might have counseled caution, but Merlin had long since passed from Arthur's side, drawn away by the enchantments of a woman, some called Nimue, and others called by different names, sealed somewhere in sleep, or stone or shadow, depending on which telling you trust. He was not there to say, "Be careful what you send your best men chasing." He was not there to remind them that some things cannot be held in human hands. So the knights rode out, one by one, and then in great numbers they left the round table and scattered across the land and beyond it, each following the Grail's light according to his own conscience, his own wound, his own particular hope. Some did not return. Others came back changed, quieter or hollowed, or burning with a faith that had no room left in it for the ordinary business of the kingdom. The table, when they gathered again, had empty seats that no one quite spoke of, and all the while, in the shadows at the edge of the golden age, other things were quietly unraveling. Guinevere and Lancelot. It is one of those stories that everyone knows, and no one fully understands, how two people who loved Arthur could also love each other in a way that made everything else impossible. There was no easy villain in it. Lancelot was, by most accounts, the finest knight who ever lived. Guinevere was a woman of rare intelligence and warmth, who had given herself to a marriage that was also a kind of public duty, a symbol, a hope. What passed between them was real. So was the harm it caused, so was the grief they carried, all three of them in their different ways. Morgause and her sons circled at the edges of things, watching. Mordred waited, patient as stone, learning the shape of the kingdom's weakness, the way water learns the shape of a crack before it freezes and splits the rock apart. Arthur knew, or half knew, and could not bring himself to act on what he knew, perhaps because to act would be to end it, to shatter the dream with his own hands rather than watch it slowly lose its light. He had given everything to build this thing. It is hard to be the one who unmakes it. So the feasts continued for a while longer. The torches still burned. Knights still rode out on errands of honor and came back with stories. The table still stood in the great hall, round and patient, holding the idea of equality, even as the men around it grew fewer and more tired and more silent. There is a kind of beauty in that, too, in the holding on, in the refusal to stop believing in something even as it changes shape. The dream of Camelot was never just about a castle or a king or a table made of ancient oak. It was about what human beings might be if they tried hard enough and chose well enough and held each other to something worth holding to. That such a thing should prove impossible does not mean it was wrong to try. The embers were cooling, but they were still warm, and in the warmth of them, in the last long glow of what had been, Arthur sat at the head of no seat and the foot of no seat, only a place among his dwindling knights, and listened to the sound of the hall breathing around him. Outside, the night had deepened. The plain below Camelot lay dark and still, and far to the west, though no one in the hall could see it, a lake lay silver under the stars, patient, watchful, waiting for what it already knew was coming. The battle came at last, as all things long dreaded finally do, not with the crash of prophecy, but quietly, on a gray morning, at a place called Camelot, where the grass was wet and the sky the color of old iron. How the fighting began, the old stories do not agree. Some say a sword was drawn over a small misunderstanding, a snake in the grass startling a nervous hand. Others say the darkness that had been gathering for years simply chose that morning to arrive. Perhaps it matters less than what followed. Arthur fought. Of course he fought. He had never known how to do otherwise. But when the day was done and the field had gone quiet, he was the last of his kind standing upon it, and he was wounded so deeply that standing itself had become a kind of prayer. Sir Bedivere found him there, leaning against a stone at the water's edge, Excalibur still in his hand. Of all the knights who had sat at the round table, Bedivere alone remained. He knelt beside his king without speaking, because there were no words large enough for the moment, and sometimes silence is the only honest thing. Arthur looked down at the sword. Even now, even here, it caught what little light the sky offered and held it. the way certain things hold beauty long past the season that made them. He turned it slowly in his hand, and then he looked at Bedivere. "Take it," he said. "Carry it to the water's edge and throw it in. Tell me what you see." Bedivere took the sword. He walked to the shore, and there he stood for a long moment, because he was only human, and Excalibur was Excalibur, and it is not easy to let go of beautiful things, even when you are told to. Twice he returned to Arthur and said he had done it. Twice Arthur looked at him and knew he had not. The third time Bedivere walked to the very lip of the lake, held the sword high, and let it go. What happened then was not a splash. What happened was something else entirely. A hand rose from the water, pale and sure and calm. The arm draped in white, as the old stories say, and caught the sword before it could touch the surface. The hand held it for a moment, 3 times over, in a slow and solemn salute, and then drew it down beneath the water, without a ripple, without a sound. The lake closed over it like a long, slow breath released. Bedivere stood and stared. When he returned to Arthur and told him what he had seen, something in the king's face eased. A tension that had been there so long, it had come to seem like part of his features, simply let go. "Good," Arthur said. "That is well." And so it was that they came to the water together, the last knight and his king. A boat waited there, low and dark and silent, attended by 3 women robed in deep hoods, their faces still and grave and kind all at once. There was no wind, and yet the boat did not drift. It simply waited, the way the lake had always waited, the way Avalon itself had always waited, folded somewhere just beyond the edge of the world. Arthur looked at his knight for a long moment. He did not say farewell. He said something quieter than that, something that carried the whole weight of Camelot and the Round Table and every fire ever lit in that great hall. And then he stepped into the boat. The 3 women received him gently. One took his head in her hands as he lay back as a mother might settle a tired child, and the boat began to move without oar or sail, sliding across the silver surface of the lake toward the west, toward the mists, toward Avalon. Bedivere watched from the shore until the mist took them. He watched long after they had gone. And Avalon received what it had always meant to receive. There, among the apple trees that never stop blossoming, in the island's deep and unhurried quiet, Arthur sleeps. Not the sleep of the dead. That is the thing the old stories are most careful to say. A different sleep. The sleep of waiting. The sleep of someone who has set down something very heavy and is resting before he lifts it again. The lake is still now. The mists lie soft across the water. Somewhere beneath or beyond all of it, Excalibur rests in hands that have held it before and will hold it again, and a king dreams the long dream of a world that might yet be better than it has been. That is what the old stories say, that he is not gone, that he is only resting, as you are resting now, in the quiet that comes after great effort, in the dark that is not empty, but full, full of old things, patient things, things that endure. Let the water close gently over the day. Let it all go still. Arthur sleeps, and so at last can you.